Welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, debate, and discussion at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. Today is February 3rd, and I'm your host, Callie Wright. I'm here with Daniel Wolfsong.
Hey, Callie.
And Jonathan Moore.
Hey!
Today we're doing some Gaytheist Bible study with a very special guest, author of Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Prove Jesus Never Existed at All, the one and only Mr. David Fitzgerald. We also have an interview with Noelle George of Secular Avenue, which is an amazing organization. We're going to hear about the work they do in helping atheists, secular folks, and LGBT people escape unsafe situations and get up on their feet. But first, since this is the first episode, I want to take some time talking about who we are and why we're here. As you heard in the intro, we are the Gaytheist Manifesto. We seek to be your source for news, commentary, debate, and discussion at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. So often you see the LGBT rights movement being claimed by some of the more progressive faith communities, and while I appreciate their allyship, I simply can't ignore the damage that's been done to the LGBT community in the name of religion. And so our goal is to be a voice for the LGBT community in the atheist movement, but to also be a voice for the atheist movement in the LGBT community. One of the things that got me started down this path was I spoke at a marriage equality rally over the summer outside of the Sixth Circuit Court in Cincinnati, Ohio. And as part of that ceremony, there was a commitment ceremony where they did a commitment ceremony for 10 or 12 gay couples. And there was an invocation given by, I believe he was a Catholic priest. And he actually used the words, "If you don't know God, you don't know love. And if you don't know love, you don't know God." And I thought to myself, sure, there are probably people there who want to hear that message. But that would be pretty off-putting there to someone who wasn't a Christian, someone who was a different religion, someone who was atheist. And I knew some of the couples there, and some of them weren't religious. There are a few other things, but that was really the genesis of this idea of activism at the intersection of LGBT issues and atheist issues. So, as for me personally, my name is Callie Wright. I'm a 30-year-old bisexual trans woman, as well as being an atheist. I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about my story, but I've been out loud and proud, living as myself for almost 2 years now. I grew up in a semi-religious environment. My mom's never been particularly religious, but my grandma is a devout Pentecostal. You know, the flag waving, running up and down the aisles, yelling and screaming, speaking in tongues. We have tambourines in the front of the church if you don't feel like you're making quite enough noise kind. Simply put, I started to actually read the Bible, and I found lots of questions that seemed to have bad answers or no answers at all, and I examined honestly the evidence available for the God I believed in. I had to conclude there was none, and then I was an atheist. I recognized my gender wasn't quite what I thought it was when I was about 10. Puberty felt wrong, and not in the way that puberty usually feels wrong for young kids. And after 28 years of denial, I finally came out and began my transition. It's been a long and difficult journey, but I wouldn't trade the experience I've had for the world. And I am here to do nothing less than change the world and make it a better place for LGBT folks and non-believers alike. So, Jonathan, let's hear some of your story.
I'm a 34-year-old gay dude. And for me, coming out as gay and atheist sort of went hand in hand, I guess. It's almost like coming out twice, you know? My mom was Jewish, and my dad was Southern Baptist, though I'm not sure how devout he was. But he died when I was 9, so I guess I'll never know. But when I was younger, in my early 20s, as I was trying to find a place in the world, I studied a lot about various world religions. It's a topic that I'm still interested in academically today, but I finally decided on joining a Messianic Jewish congregation, which seemed to neatly fit my dual heritage. So I ended up coming out as gay while I was attending that group, and it was a pretty bad experience, to say the least. One of the things I was doing, to be a good person, there was this 12-year-old boy whose parents were going through some hard times, and, I was kind of like a big brother to him. We would hang out and go to the movies and stuff like that, and just, pal around. After I came out, I basically got accused of being a pedophile, and I could never see him again. And, apparently all gay guys are into kids, which is, of course, not true. That started me to make me take a long, hard look at religion. Now, it's not to say I was angry at God, but I just looked at stuff from an objective perspective, and it just didn't make any sense to me. I did a lot more reading and research and came to the conclusion that the world made more sense without God. I've always been in the notion that I want the truth, regardless of whether it's the answer I'm looking for. Other than that, I'm a college student, an artist, and an all-around nice guy.
And I'll add to that, one of my favorite human beings. I love you, Jonathan.
You.
Daniel, let's hear a little bit about your story.
Okay, I'm a cisgender gay man. I'm 36 years old, and I was raised in a very religious environment, Christian environment. I got really into it in my teen years. By the time I was about 18 or 19, I had questions that the Bible couldn't answer, and my pastor couldn't answer. My parents certainly couldn't answer. And basically, I just got really tired of, well, God works in mysterious ways. That was just an answer that wasn't working for me. So that was like this loose thread, and the more I tugged on it, the more the whole thing just unraveled until I just couldn't believe in God and Christianity anymore, while being intellectually honest with myself. So I began the very slow journey, the very painful journey, very excruciating journey of unbrainwashing myself from all the destructive ideas I picked up about myself and my sexuality and my mind from all those years under the influence of Christians. And I'm not an atheist because I hate God, and I certainly don't hate Christians. I'm an atheist because I follow reason and logic, and I follow kindness and compassion, and I just don't need a deity for that, or a religious framework for that matter. And I think religion is doing a lot of harm to our society, and it's certainly doing harm to the queer community. So I'm all about positive atheism and basically using it as a vehicle to reach out to folks and have healthy debate and progress civilization. I think ultimately that's what the atheist movement is about. So that's me.
And add to that, another one of my favorite humans.
Oh, likewise.
Amen, brother.
In all seriousness, I'm very excited to be doing this with the both of you. I love you both to death, and I'm ready to change the world with you guys.
I'm so ready for that.
So, who's stoked on some Gaytheist Bible study with David Fitzgerald?
Ooh, me.
We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with more of the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Here's an excerpt from Sex and God by Daryl Ray.
Hello, I'm David Smalley, the proud producer for this audiobook and president of Dogma Debate. If you don't know Dr. Daryl Ray, you're going to find this book an eye-opening and entertaining experience. Of course, this book is about sex, but it's also about so much more, and you'll find out what I mean as you listen. Dr. Ray takes us on a journey that demonstrates exactly how much religious culture has distorted our views of our bodies, our relationships, our expectations about marriage, dating and love, and even our politics. Dr. Daryl Ray is a psychologist and a lifelong student of religion and culture. He's been seen on ABC News, on many national radio shows, and even international documentaries. He was recently featured on an episode of Professor Richard Dawkins' Sex, Death, and the Meaning of Life. His research on sex and secularism has been written about in Playboy magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the Daily Mail, the New York Times, and dozens of other newspapers and magazines. He's the founder of the international organization recoveringfromreligion.org and writes an answer column for Teens Without God. He's traveled and spoken throughout North America, Europe, and Australia. You can listen to interviews of him on many podcasts, including Dogma Debate, that deal with religion or human sexuality. After reading Sex and God, you may want to learn more about the psychology of religion. I know I did. For this, you can listen to his earlier bestseller, The God Virus. It's on audiobook as well. You can find many of his talks on YouTube, including topics like the psychology of religion, sex and religion, hypnosis and church services, that's one of my favorites, and evolution and religious sexuality. I sincerely hope this audiobook does for you what it did for me. Aside from being a pleasurable, entertaining, and funny experience, I learned a lot from this one, and I'm sure you will too.
Sex and God by Daryl Ray is available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
I am here with David Fitzgerald, author of Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All, and the upcoming Jesus Mything in Action for our inaugural Gaytheist Bible study. David, how are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm so glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. So the subject today is Romans 1:24-32. Therefore God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. For this cause God gave them up to dishonorable affections, for even their women exchanged the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust toward one another, males with males, working out shamefulness and receiving in themselves the recompense which was fitting for their error. And even as they did not think fit to have God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do the things not right, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, being full of envy, murder, quarrels, deceit, evil habits, becoming whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, insolent, proud, braggarts, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, perfidious, without natural affection, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous order of God, that those practicing such things are worthy of death, not only do them, but have pleasure in those practicing them. Wow.
Or, in other words, your average Tuesday night in San Francisco.
Exactly. So the interesting thing about this is obviously that it's post Old Covenant, the argument that you always hear about why all that stuff in the Old Testament doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah, if you just strictly go by the Gospels and follow by what Jesus says, he says that nothing will change at all in the Old Testament, and then he goes on to change everything. But he also never says anything about either lesbianism or homosexuality at all.
Right.
For what it's worth. I mean, personally, if you've read Nailed, you know I don't think Jesus existed at all.
Right.
But whoever wrote the stories of Jesus didn't have anything to say about homosexuality.
So there are a couple of things in here that kind of stuck out to me. You know a little bit more about this than I do. But the first thing is where it talks about the natural use of a woman. Is that really as objectifying as it sounds?
I was thinking the exact same thing. He doesn't have a lot of... Paul, in his genuine letters, doesn't have a lot of good things to say about women. And actually, in the letters that were forged by other people in Paul's name, they don't have any good things to say about women either. So one thing we can definitely say about the early church is they're very ambivalent not just to homosexuality, but to heterosexuality. In fact, we have a lot of early Christian writings that didn't make it into the Bible, but they're stories where, for instance, what usually happens is a rich pagan woman converts to Christianity and then decides she's not going to have sex with her husband anymore. That's like a total stereotypical trope that happens in early Christian writings. So it wasn't just that they were against burning for lust with each other, mano a mano or femme a femme, but yeah, they didn't think anybody should be having sex at all. Because
nobody needs to procreate, right?
It's really obvious there's an apocalyptic emphasis in early Christian writings because Paul keeps saying things like, oh, don't worry about getting married or pleasing your wife because Jesus is going to be here any minute, any second now. So there's no time to get married. And it's not until later generations of Christianity that we see that do a complete 180 and they realize that the church is going to be around for the long haul so that maybe we should have babies.
And no one thought to say like, we've thought that he was coming back soon and he's not. So maybe this whole thing isn't true.
Well, when we read the epistles, actually, we do see that complaint is addressed because there were Christians who were saying, well, or rather critics of Christianity who were saying, you keep saying that Jesus is going to be here any minute, but it's been decades and decades and decades and he hasn't come back yet. And so they warn against giving up the faith about that. And then that's where you see things like, oh, because a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years. That's when they start using that kind of argument.
Right, the fun little mental gymnastics that they do.
Oh, it never stops. It never stops.
So to the meat of this whole thing, this reads to me like it's basically saying gay people deserve death. It says,
absolutely.
These people aforementioned deserve death, and anyone who supports them deserves death.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it's saying. And the ironic thing about that is this is coming from Paul, and I have a talk where I argue that Paul is probably the biggest closet case in ancient Christianity.
Oh, I have to hear more about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's the thing about Paul. Paul was a lot of things, but happy and carefree he was not. And throughout his writings, we get this sense that he's in great, deep pain about it, that he's a profound state of despair. He says things that make us think that maybe it's a physical problem. He says, there was a thorn given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me humble, and that 3 times he's appealed to the Lord about this that would leave me. And people have been speculating for generations and generations about what this may have been, and they've said, well, maybe it was epilepsy, maybe he was a bad speaker, or maybe it was a malaria, or speech disability, or an earache. But none of those guesses seem capable of causing the depths of negativity that he's constantly falling in. There's one verse that kind of gives us a hint, and it's later in this very book, Romans 7, where he says this amazing thing. And let me read the whole thing to you.
Yeah, please do.
For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good, but in fact, it's no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it's no longer I that do it, but the sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God with my innermost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? That's Romans 7:14-24. And man, he is not talking about an earache.
Right. Well, and maybe this is just my 21st century perverted childlike mentality, but I hear the word members and I think,
Exactly, right? I mean, he keeps saying that, it's no less than an evil that he can't even understand that lives within him and makes him do that which he hates against his will. And he knows what he should do, but the sin that's living in his members wars with him, making him captive, and says with his flesh he's a slave to the law of sin. Well, that's a very interesting thing to say. And what else does Paul feel strongly about? Well, if it's one thing he hates, it's homosexuals. He constantly blasts these people and talks about their uncleanliness and their vile passions and the effeminate and sodomites and those who abuse themselves with mankind. And he really, really, really hates men who do such evil things.
So he's Fred Phelps, is what you're saying.
Well, there's the thing. He's not all that crazy about women either, because he says things like it's good for a man not to touch a woman, but he always repeatedly instructs the men to greet each other with a holy kiss. He's deeply ambivalent about marriage. He advises unmarried men not to seek a wife, and says he shouldn't care about how he should please his wife. He should care about how he pleases his Lord. But he begrudgingly allows that some men, unlike Paul, can't seem to control their urges towards women. So if they can't remain unencumbered by a woman and practice self-control like Paul can, well, then he supposes they should marry because it's better to marry than to burn with passion. But it's just a concession on his part. He really has no use for the distractions of women, and what he really wishes is that all men could be like he is. And so if you're like me, and there's something that seems awfully gay about that, you're not the first to think so either. The Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong drew a tremendous amount of outrage from his fellow Christians when he first dared to consider the possibility that Paul was gay. And I remember when I first read that in one of his books, and I thought, thank you, I thought I was the only one that was thinking this. But it seems really clear that Paul's the thorn in his side is nothing physical. It's nothing less than total closet case homophobia. It seems like a perfect classic case of latent homosexuality.
That's something that so many LGBT people struggle with, is internalized homophobia and internalized transphobia and internalized misogyny. And I mean, all joking aside, like, that reads like the dialogue that I had with myself before I came out. And, the dialogue, you hear so many people, you grow up in this culture of, being gay is this horrible thing. And like, that sounds, I mean, it's, fancy language, but like, that sounds exactly like the conversation we always have with ourselves.
Exactly. He clearly is at war with himself. And there's other writings that he did that we don't have, where he says he wrote a letter of many tears, and out of afflictions and anguish of heart he wrote to you. But they didn't save that letter, so we don't know what was in that. But we do have one letter he wrote, and that's the Book of Philemon. It's called the Book of Philemon, but it's really just a short letter, and it's really worth reading because it's a letter to a fellow Christian who, on the surface, it just seems that he's writing to Philemon to forgive this runaway slave Onesimus, who's now a Christian. And theologians forever have discussed it and said that it's a comment about how there's no slave or free, that all are the same in Christ. And when you read the letter, it's like, no, it's none of those things. The whole point of the letter is that he's not asking Philemon to forgive his slave boy. He's asking Philemon to send his slave boy back to Paul because he ministers to Paul in his chains. I mean, the whole letter from start to finish is nothing but, give me back my slave boy. Give him back to me. I don't want to force you to do anything. You just owe me your salvation and all. But, do it. I'm confident. I don't want to tell you what to do, but I'm confident you'll do the right thing. So it kills me. First of all, the way he's putting on the guilt thumbscrews to this guy. It's hilarious, really.
You have started a new obsession for me. I'm about to dive down the rabbit hole on this.
There you go. You start, and you start realizing that when you look at his whole career, he doesn't have time for women because he's hanging out with his beloved slave boy Onesimus, or his beloved fellow missionary Timothy, or his beloved fellow missionary Barnabas. All these guys that he spends his life with. There's one verse where he talks about how he doesn't want a wife. The word they use is actually a sister wife, like the Brethren of the Lord do. This other Christian group. A sister wife is somebody who will cook for him and clean up for him, but not have sex with him. That's the whole point, is that they're celibate Christian wives in all but sex. So it cracks me up that that's the only time we ever see that he has any interest in doing anything with a woman.
That is textbook repression. Holy crap!
It is, isn't it? I mean, I can't prove it mathematically, but when I read this stuff, it just leaps out at me, and it's like, wow. And it's fascinating that the verses of the Bible that are most often used to justify millennia of homophobia and misogyny came from the pen of a person who seems to me, by every indication, to be a self-loathing homosexual.
Wow. That's heavy.
To me, too. And it's fascinating to me to speculate what might have happened to Christianity if Paul had come out of the closet. And on the one hand, without his pent-up neuroses driving him, would his Christian mission even survived? Or would it have been transformed into a gentler, more tolerant faith right from the get-go? The what-ifs just never end.
Yeah. So another question that I had, because I was having a debate with somebody on Facebook once, and I posted this whole thing, and there's the unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, and all of that sort of thing. And the way that kind of reads to me is that those are all adjectives that are being used to describe these people who are acting this way. The way the person tried to argue it with me was that it was being gay is bad, plus all of these things are bad too. It wasn't that.
No, that's not what he's saying. In fact, he says the same thing when he talks about unbelievers. That there's no good in them. They're 100%. It's not. You can't parse it out that way because he's not doing that in his writing. He's saying they are this, and this, and this. And if you're one of these, you're all of these. Basically, is what he's saying.
Well, right, and that was the conversation where it's, oh, well, that's I would say something about Leviticus, and oh, well, that's the old covenant, that doesn't apply anymore.
Oh, that's the old thing. That's
right.
Yeah. God didn't know what he was doing when he did that. That's always cracks me up.
Well, yeah, me too. And I always think to myself, like, okay, I'm going to grant that argument for a second. I mean, I don't actually grant that argument,
sure,
but I'm going to grant that argument for a second and say that if I had been born in the wrong time, it would have been the law to kill me.
Absolutely, and there's more time when that was the case than not the case in Christianity.
Awesome. Well, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to go over. I sincerely appreciate you taking the time out to do the first episode.
I am honored that I'm on your inaugural episode. That really means a lot to me. Thank you for that.
Thank you, David Fitzgerald, for being on the show. I hope to talk to you soon.
You too.
So, guys, apparently Paul was gay. It's obviously something that we could probably never know for sure, but just listening to the things that David said about the internal struggle that Paul apparently had sounds to me a whole lot like the conversation I had with myself before coming out. What about you guys?
Oh, for sure. And I mean, for years before I came out, I mean, that was like, being raised in a Christian home and being raised with those values, that was sort of my inner monologue throughout my entire teenage years and into my 20s until I, really became comfortable with it.
Yeah, and that's, I feel like that's such a sense of internalized homophobia, and for me, transphobia, and even misogyny a little bit. Like, I knew that I was really a woman, but that wasn't okay because being a woman isn't a good thing to be, kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting that like the extreme misogyny and homophobia of those ancient cultures was reflected in the, quote, voice of God through these biblical prophets. Like, that's right. Not a coincidence.
And we do have to remember, we have to put it in cultural context. What was going on at the time. What we consider homosexuality or all these things didn't really exist back then. It was fairly common, I know, in Greek culture for men to be married to women, but also have male lovers. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if he was speaking to that, or what exactly was the context behind his statement.
Well, the Greeks were a lot more lenient. The ancient Greeks, they were a little more lenient in their views toward homosexuality. They weren't crazy about it, but compared to the Hebrew culture, they were a lot more liberal about it.
And of course, at the time, I know there was a big clash between the Hellenization of the Hebrew culture. There were people that were very easily taking up the Greek culture, and others who were very hesitant to do that, and very against it, in fact. And it could have been that Paul was speaking from that angle as well. Well,
and I feel like it also comes back to this idea that God always seems to agree with your own morality.
Yep.
Weirdly. So Paul had this internalized homophobia about himself and decided to turn it outward and talk about how terrible a thing it was, while later in this same book alluding to fighting against this thing that he quote-unquote knew was wrong but couldn't help himself from feeling. Another thing that David said that really made me think is that it seems that the Bible is not only against homosexuality, but in certain parts is actually against heterosexuality too. This idea that you don't have to worry about pleasing your wife because Jesus is coming soon, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a near total disregard for women in the Bible as far as what they get out of sex. It's kind of like they're there to have children and to please men. And even the second one is debatable in most cases, probably.
Yeah, I know Paul wrote something about how it's much better to be celibate than anything else, but that he understands not everyone can. But if you can, do it. So.
Yeah, there was an interesting sort of what if scenario David proposed when he said something like, what would have happened to Christianity if Paul had come out of the closet or not been so poisoned by internalized homophobia? It's interesting because, if he had spoken differently about it, or if he had come to peace with that, I mean, I'm not even sure how much one could have come to terms with it in that culture, in that time period. But it makes me wonder, would homosexuality still be as vilified today as it is, which is, mostly based on these biblical ideas, or would his story have even been told?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because the culture itself was obviously so misogynistic and so oppressive that, even if he had come out and said, he very well might have been stoned to death, and, the things that he contributed to the Bible may not have even been there.
Right.
I don't think Christianity would exist without Paul. I mean, Jesus started it, but Paul made it what it was. It would have probably died out without him.
That is a great point. And that's going to do it for this first edition of Gaytheist Bible Study. We want to thank David Fitzgerald again for being here with us on our first episode. We will be right back with more of the Gaytheist Manifesto right after this.
Here's an excerpt from Mum, Dad, I'm an Atheist by David G. McAfee.
It is the same highly regarded concept of an afterlife that allows misguided religious people to justify the mistreatment of those who disagree with their religious ideologies. They are simply trying to protect you from eternal damnation in the afterlife by condemning you, insulting you, and even disowning you in this life. It is not to say that becoming open about your disbelief is always going to be met with these negative reactions, and, in fact, that is precisely what this work is hoping to prevent. But it is important to understand that if you experience negative reactions from religious kin, it is probably a result from the religion's teachings, and likely not from any personal vendetta or hatred.
Mom, Dad, I'm an Atheist by David G. McAfee is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
Welcome back to the Gaytheist Manifesto. Noelle George is a prolific secular activist. She founded the Secular Center in Houston, Texas, spent time traveling the country speaking with local groups about volunteering, leadership, organizational skills, and feminism. She merged the Secular Center with Foundation Beyond Belief and has held several roles there, including Volunteers Beyond Belief Coordinator and Director of Operations, and is currently their Director of Special Projects. She's also now the Director of Secular Avenue, a 501c3 organization formed to help secular people in need to achieve safety, stability, and autonomy. So without further ado, here it is, my interview with Noelle George of Secular Avenue. Noelle George, welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Why don't you just tell me a little bit about Secular Avenue, if there's a story behind how it got started, what inspired you to do what you do?
Okay, well, there's a couple things that inspired me to start Secular Avenue. One is that in 2011 I founded an online community for atheist moms, and sometimes people would post about situations that they were in, domestic violence, sexual violence, social and financial isolation, things like that, and they had no support networks and no resources to leave, and it was really surprising how many people were in abusive or unsafe situations, but they didn't have a way out. They weren't sure what to do. And I watched as the members of the community came together in pretty amazing ways to help each other. They would send clothes and toys, set up online fundraising pages. A member of our group, actually, I'll call her Susan, and she's given permission to share this story. Was traveling internationally with her family when her husband physically abused her, and another member of the group drove for several hours across international lines to transport her and her children to a safe place. So,
wow.
Yeah. They just really came together, and there was such amazing stories, and the capacity was there, and it was so inspiring. But for every person who tells their story, there are others who don't know where to go. Might only have, as far as local resources, religious places to turn to. So I wanted to formalize those efforts, help people specifically in the secular community, if wherever possible, and ensure that atheists who were in unsafe, difficult situations would have access to resources to get to safety, stability, and autonomy.
Well, yeah, and I think that's really important, because so often those resources aren't necessarily hard to find in some places, but as atheists and secular people, so many of those organizations are faith-based. Mm-hmm. And even if they say, oh, well, we help anyone, the environment is still not necessarily welcoming to people who aren't comfortable in those environments, or whose, what they're running from may be part of a religious environment and they don't want to go back to that.
Right, and people are in such a vulnerable situation when they're, I want to target several demographics, both the domestic violence, which is what this atheist group inspired. Also, the LGBT community coming out is a difficult process, and also people who are leaving religion. And so I wanted to target these groups, especially in the beginning, to provide aid, because I think it's really important for everyone to have a safe place at home, and if they don't have a safe place, it's important to help them get to a safe place. So these were 3 demographics that we targeted right in the beginning, as saying, I think there's a need here.
Yeah, going through your website, one of the things that I was really, really impressed by was the emphasis on the idea of the safe space. And the links, there are links if you're feeling triggered, you click this link and you leave the website immediately. And I think that that speaks very highly to how cognizant you are of how vulnerable a position these folks are in. And I think that's so important, because some people just don't realize that.
It's such especially coming out as LGBTQ, it is such a difficult process. I've identified as bi since I was pretty young, but I've just recently come out again as queer. So, and I live in Korea. I don't know if we didn't say that. I live in Korea with my husband and daughter. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's been very challenging to come out in such an isolated environment. I'm lucky that I haven't been in an unsafe situation, and I've had people around me who have been supportive. But having gone through that process twice now, right, I actually feel very strongly about including LGBTQ people in our demographic, because coming out is such there are really no words for it, are there?
No, it's really not. And in a lot of ways, it's because sometimes the situations are so diverse, but sometimes it's just really hard for someone who hasn't been through that to comprehend it. You can describe the situation and you can talk about it all day long, and people can oh yeah, that must be really hard. Oh yeah, I can imagine how tough that would be. But it's like, no, you probably don't. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's hard to try to imagine what something is like if it's not your lived experience, for sure. My personal experience has been one of support, but it's still an incredibly vulnerable time, and I think it's really important for especially secular LGBTQ people who may be coming out and may not be in a supportive environment. Could you imagine kind of going through that process, maybe talking to your parents about it, and then finding that they're going to kick you out, or worrying about your father or your mother harming you physically because they disagree with what you've told them or whatever. Even having gone through the coming out process, right. It's hard for me to imagine that scenario, and we really want to help people who are in that situation.
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason I feel such a push to do what I do is because my coming out experience has been much better than I imagined it would be. I've still struggled a lot, and I've had problems, and I've gotten to pretty dark places, but in general, I've found an amazing community of support in the LGBT community where I live and among my friends and family. And I feel like there are so many people out there that are they spend all their time just trying to survive. Mm-hmm. And I have the privilege of having the support system. So I feel like that obligates me to speak on those folks' behalf that, they don't have a decent job. They can't afford to produce a podcast or, to spend time finding and talking to people online. So yeah, I can absolutely identify with what you're saying there.
Yeah, I think the podcast is a fantastic idea. I don't know why someone hasn't done it sooner.
Well, I'll probably go through this at some point, some other point in the episode. But what really got me started was one of the first speaking engagements that I did when I was out as Callie was a marriage equality rally, and part of the ceremony was they did a commitment ceremony for gay couples. And it was officiated by, I believe he was a Catholic priest. And I figured, okay, plenty of LGBT people are religious and they find something in faith, and I don't want to take that away from them. So I figured there would be an element of that. But the guy actually used the words, if you don't know God, you don't know love. And if you don't know love, you don't know God. Really? And I was just thinking that is not something I ever imagined I would hear at an LGBT event.
Yeah, you would think it would be more inclusive of different faiths. And
yeah. So that was kind of the genesis of this idea. And with what happened with Leila Alcorn and the the religious part that surrounded that, I just sort of felt like this is something that has to be done. And yeah. I don't, there are a few voices that are pretty loud in the atheist community about LGBT issues, but I don't know if there's anyone that actually, that's just their thing. So that's kind of who I want to be.
Right.
So getting back to your organization, So tell me a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the help that you provide to people when they come to you and say, hey, I'm in a bad situation and I need help to get out.
Sure. What happens is that people fill out an application. It's on our website, and I'm going to plug the website now. It's www.secularavenue.org. There's a place on our website where you can fill out an application. It's actually under the We Can Help link, and then it's safe application. So people fill out an application, and we get that, and we respond to them within 24 hours, just letting them know that we got the application and that we're reviewing it. And we try for within 72 hours to discuss, collect more information if we need to, and approve or decline the application. And what happens internally is that board and staff get together and just kind of say, what is this person's situation? How can we help them to, not just be a stopgap measure, but be more permanently in a better situation? Do they feel is their greatest need? Do we feel is their greatest need after listening to, and collecting all the information? Those kinds of questions are what we ask, and then we come back and we start kind of providing the help. And the help falls into 4 categories. Resource coordination, which is like local resources in their area. We look into those. We try to find secular resources, which surprisingly there are often not a lot of, maybe unsurprisingly. Second category is financial assistance, right? For them to get a temporary cell phone if they need something that they can use to call in an emergency, to call local help, that kind of thing. And then offer free therapy services. So if they don't have access to therapy somewhere else, they can talk with our counselor who's on a volunteer therapist on our team. And then the last thing is legal assistance and advocacy. And we're building a database of lawyers in all 50 states and actually around the world in case we get someone who is international. Haven't yet, but we are preparing for that. So we can refer a person who applies to us for help to a legal resource or a specific secular lawyer that's in their area, and they can get assistance from that.
If I can be honest, I'm just in awe. Like, this is what you do is so incredible. Just throw it out there. When I was going through your website, I started to actually kind of get nervous. I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. These people are amazing. And I started to kind of fangirl out a little bit.
I was nervous before. I always get nervous before interviews. So we were both nervous. So
well, good. I'm glad. The other thing that I saw on your website that I thought was really great and, might not necessarily be something that people would think about are the safety tips and all the sort of practical kinds of things that someone who's trying to leave a situation like that can do to kind of prepare themselves. So could you talk a little bit about that and kind of what kinds of general things, if someone's listening who might be in this situation, the kinds of things that they can do to help themselves?
One of the things that I think is really important is to, especially for in the case of spousal abuse, is to start a journal. Write down everything that you remember about past abuse and continue to add to it as abuse occurs, because in a spousal abuse situation, there is usually a court involved when, and actually in a child-parent abuse situation, this can happen too. Like if, for example, someone is a teenager and they're coming out and they're experiencing abuse from their parents, it can help with emancipation proceedings, so it can also apply in that case. But in terms of spousal or family abuse, if there's a divorce proceeding that needs to happen later, that journal can really help with that. So I think that is super important. Another thing that the journal can do is oftentimes it's really hard to leave. I think the statistic is that someone leaves, it takes them about 7 times to leave a spouse in the case of spousal abuse situation. 7 times, or an average of 7 times it might be. That's pretty incredible that someone would go back to someone that they were abused by 7 times before they can actually find the resources to leave.
And that actually brings up a good point, I think. One of the things that you hear so often when people are talking about abusive relationships is, well, if you stay, then it becomes your fault. Can you kind of speak to that and why that's not actually the case, and why that's actually a really unhelpful thing to say?
I would say first, unequivocally, abuse is never the person's fault. Even if they stay, even if they go back, or even if they don't follow the tips we have on our website, we have that on our website. Abuse is never the person's who's, the abusee's fault. I think that there are lots of reasons that people stay, but, it's kind of like rape culture. I want to make that comparison a little bit, even though they're not the same thing, but it's like saying, why did you get raped, instead of why do people rape? Why, trying to educate against rape with the people who are inclined to rape, with the rapists, instead of saying, well, the victims should be, I'm trying really hard to use inclusive language here too and not talk about women or men in general, because I don't want to do that. But it's always a little bit hard when we're socialized to separate it in that way. So bear with me. But
oh, you're okay.
Okay. It's really important to educate the rapists about why it's not okay to rape. It's not okay to go and say to the victims, you should have done this, you should have done that, you shouldn't have worn this, you shouldn't have worn that. It's not their fault. And that's a parallel to me with people saying what you're talking about, Callie, which is that, well, it's your fault if you stay. If you were abused and then you stay, it's your fault. It's never the person's fault. We need to place the blame where it lies, which is with the abuser, and say it's not okay to abuse. And there are lots of reasons that people stay. And, no one should feel ashamed or embarrassed or guilty or like it's their fault if they stay after an abusive situation. And we can't know the person's situation. We're not in their shoes, so we can't know what they're experiencing and the reasons why they stay.
Absolutely. I mean, and I've heard of, people stay out of fear because they're afraid that they'll get hurt even more badly if they leave. If the abuse becomes traumatic, and become convinced that they deserve it and that it's their fault, even though it's not.
I was going to say, we have this on our website too, but the most likely predictor of whether a victim of violence permanently separates from their abuser is whether or not they have the financial resources to survive without them. I don't remember where that statistic comes from, but it's really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because a lot of times, I guess, people think like, well, where am I going to go? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go live in my car.
Yeah, and if they have kids, they might be worried about their kids. The thing about abuse, especially if it's ongoing, is it's not just physical abuse normally. It's emotional abuse, financial isolation, limiting. Like one person who Secular Avenue hasn't helped but has told us her story, talks about how her husband in the military and left for a little while to do some kind of training, I think. And he was gone for 2 weeks maybe, and he left her $50 for food. When people are controlled in that way financially and when they're emotionally abused, it's very hard to think clearly. It's very hard to believe that you don't deserve this. There's just so many factors. Not just like someone all of a sudden happens, but a lot of times it's not like someone all of a sudden just gets into a physical abuse situation and there's not other things going on.
Right. Something that's important to call out is that, as atheists, a lot of times we like to pride ourselves on thinking rationally, and these are not situations that are conducive to rational thinking. We see people acting irrationally in the name of religion, and we point that that person's acting irrational, so that's a knock on their character, and that stigma sometimes transfers to people who are dealing with mental illness or people who are in abusive relationships and haven't figured out how to leave. So that's part of the reason that I think this conversation is so important, especially for the atheist community, because sometimes we get wrapped up in the rationality thing and forget that there are situations that make that really, really difficult, even for people who are otherwise, very rationally, skeptically minded people.
Right. Mom actually also works domestic abuse situations. She volunteers for a shelter in her area. And I were talking the other day, and she was saying, and I agree with her, that it's usually more complicated than just somebody hit somebody else or somebody physically abused somebody else. There's usually other things going on that makes it more complicated. And, we have to be cognizant of that as we're working with our clients, and I think we are.
And it becomes kind of a slippery slope. I think things start out small. Somebody maybe they'll say something that's insulting or hurtful or abusive, and it may be kind of easy to write that off at first as, they were just mad. We'll let it pass. It's no big deal. And things kind of progress, and before you know it, you're knee deep in the situation, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, how did I get here?
And if you can imagine someone who is in this situation, they're vulnerable, and then they're trying to find help, and all they can find is religious help. That much more difficult. And there are in my research that I've done since having the idea for this organization and looking at different locations, resources in those areas, overwhelmingly is religious. Really, really overwhelmingly, like 95% maybe in some places, 100%. Wow. And the places that aren't religious are over capacity. The shelters that I look into, they say call first because we need, to check if we actually have any beds available, if we actually have any space available. So there's definitely a need out there for a place like Secular Avenue, especially for people who are secular, who we don't want to be prayed over when they're receiving help, or don't want to be told that their faith wasn't strong enough, or don't want to lie and say that they are religious in order to receive help.
The thing that I always think of, people who do what you do, people who provide help, you do take on a heavy burden. And the thing that I always wonder is, who helps the helpers? What do you do to decompress, to get out from under the weight of what you do? If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that.
Hammett asked me the same question on his podcast, actually. So
nice. Great minds think alike. I'll take that.
I think that self-care is really important for everybody. I think for me, this is my passion. helping people is fulfilling for me. So there's that. But I think it is definitely important to decompress. I do it by running and by reading fluffy, books that don't require my brain to work, or watching fluff TV. I do it by spending time with my daughter. I do it by travel. We're lucky in Korea. We're able to get to a lot of really interesting places that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So Korea has had its challenges, but it's also had its rewards.
Very cool. Yeah, that's if there's a message that I can get any budding activists, is that don't forget self-care. Because, diving headfirst into this whole thing myself, that's something I've forgotten. I've done a lot of work in my local LGBT community, and, sometimes I get buried in things, and I think to myself, like, sometimes I just want to watch Doctor Who, eat ice cream, and just feel feelings for a minute.
Yeah, I love Doctor Who.
Right.
Another thing I want to say real quick is just that, there's the realization that the people that we're helping are just so much more, they have so much more to deal with. Like, having it be a little bit hard to hear their stories is nothing compared with them living it.
Absolutely.
And so taking time out for to realize my life can be hard sometimes. I'm lucky in a lot of ways. That can help too,
Yeah, it goes back to kind of recognizing the ways the ways you have privilege, so you can kind of use that to help other people.
Right, and just appreciating things that you have in your life. Just kind of taking moments out for gratification, I guess, or gratitude.
Awesome. Well, last but not least, to talk a little bit about what anyone who is interested in what you do and wants to help, what are ways that folks can get involved and support what you do?
Looking for lawyers and therapists to join our network. So there's that. If somebody out there is a lawyer, they can contact us at secularavenue@gmail.com. Provide us with their information, and we can add them to our network. It's not just pro bono work, although it would be nice to have a ton of lawyers come to us and say, we're willing to help you pro bono. But,
right.
We can work out arrangements there. Consultations would definitely be a big help. The lawyers do that. And then therapists, we definitely need volunteer therapists to join our therapist network. We also, we really need funds to help us provide for the people that are contacting us. So if people can donate, that's probably the main thing that keeps some of us up at night on the board, is that people are coming to us for help. And if they keep coming to us at this rate for help, we want to help at least 20 people this year, and we definitely need funds to do that. So anything helps, as far as, $25 can provide a care package for somebody who's trying to get to a safe place. $5 can help. 5 people donate $5, that provides a care package. Anything will really help us in the financial side. And we're a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible.
Awesome. Well, Noelle, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with us, and thank you on behalf of the community for what you do. What you do is amazing, and I want to do everything that I can to support. So just thank you so much for what you do and for taking the time out today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be on your first episode, and I'm proud to be here and part of the community, and I appreciate the exposure that you're giving us with your podcast. So thank you.
So guys, I need to make a confession. I totally fangirled out in the process of interviewing Noelle. I read their website and the things that they do, and I was already pretty nervous to talk to her because I have so much respect for what they do. And when we were talking, I just couldn't help. I felt like a giddy schoolgirl. I don't know. She's just so awesome, and what they do is so great.
Noelle was talking about how it's hard to imagine something that hasn't been your experience. that really hit home for me because I know when I've talked to some of my straight friends about the progress of the gay rights movement and mainstream culture's evolution toward accepting gay people as equals, and they've been pretty surprised to hear me say things like, even just walking down the street holding hands with my boyfriend, there's this subroutine running in my head about, is someone going to verbally abuse us? Is someone going to be violent toward us? I think it's some of the finer points of living life in the queer spectrum that a lot of folks don't really even think about because it's just so off the map of their own experience.
Yeah, I think that's something that I think about a lot because I don't always get read as female when I'm out in public. If I put a decent amount of effort into my appearance, I usually do. But that's a constant worry that I have of people laughing, people pointing, and as much as you want to say that you let stuff like that roll off your back and let it not bother you. I mean, at least for me, it does. That may be a failing on my part, but when she said that really kind of hit home for me too, and that goes even back to the work that Secular Avenue does with people who are in abusive situations or people who are in abusive relationships and people who are in abusive situations in relation to religion. That's just a paradigm that so many people don't understand, and I think that's part of the problem.
And I don't think it's a failing of your character to let that get you down. I mean, we're social beings. We're literally hardwired to want acceptance from the society we live in. So when you feel rejected, especially when you're just walking out the door and it's like the rejection's just hitting you in the face every time you walk outside the door, just to go get groceries. That takes a huge toll, and it's something that people who don't have to deal with that experience, they really can't imagine it. It's impossible for them to imagine it. It's just the nature of it.
And acceptance doesn't mean that you have to necessarily understand it. I could never say that I understand Callie's experience of biologically being differently gendered than how you feel inside, but it doesn't mean I don't accept her.
That's a lesson that I've had to learn myself about a lot of my friends is I worry so much that my life experience is now so much different than all of my friends that we kind of grow apart just because we kind of live in the same or in a completely different frame of reference than we used to. And I have to keep reminding myself that a lot of my friends have experiences that I don't have. Mm-hmm. I'm 30 years old, and I'm fortunate enough that I've never had to deal with losing someone that I love really close to me. Mm. I know that's something that's going to happen because that's what happens in life. But my friend Eric lost his dad when we were 18. I didn't know what it was like for him to go through losing a parent, but I was able to be there for him through that. And obviously losing a parent and coming out living as a trans person, those aren't the same experiences, but it's still something I had no frame of reference for, but it's something I was able to support him through. So that's what I think is so important about the work that organizations like Secular Avenue do, because it's not only about helping people out of those situations, but it's also about educating the public so we as a society can rally around these people and help them get out of these situations, because so often people can't get out of this situation because they're afraid to talk about it, because there's a stigma that surrounds being a victim of abuse, that you somehow deserve it or that it's a knock on your character, so you're afraid to talk about it, and that perpetuates the cycle. And I think that that's part of what is so important about what they do, is sort of removing that stigma and that can be just as much of a help, I think.
And I think, I think people forget that abuse doesn't have to just be physical. It can be very mental and psychological. It can be constantly being derogatory towards someone, yelling at them, being rude, and that's just as much abuse as hitting.
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. And, one of the things that I talked with her about is I think part of what makes it harder is sometimes it starts with little verbal or psychological things before it gets physical. Mm-hmm. It can be somebody saying something really angry or being insulting, and sometimes if it's something that's not part of a pattern, it can be easy to write those things off. Oh, they were just mad. They said something they didn't mean. No big deal. and that eventually escalates, and then you're in very, very deep. And you're thinking to myself, oh my gosh, how did I get into this situation? But you can look back and you can see the escalation, and it's like the frog in boiling water analogy, where you don't really realize how bad the situation gets until it's really, really bad.
And sometimes people never see it. They never realize the situation that they're in. And when that happens, it's really sad. I'm glad Noelle talked about self-care. When I think you had asked her who helps the helpers, and she started talking about self-care. Self-care for me, it's a big thing, and it's a super important thing. I think it is for everyone, but it's something I think about a lot because she was saying it in the sort of the framework of your question. If you're someone who's giving a lot of energy to other people, if you're if you're giving a lot of yourself to the healing of other people, you need self-care. Kind of in line with what you were just talking about, a lot of folks are going through really deep depression from their situation, whether it's questioning LGBTQ people who are trying to discover themselves or find themselves in the midst of an abusive environment or a religious environment that keeps them feeling repressed. Self-care can seem like something that it's maybe pointless or doesn't even come up, but I know that it's something that's helped me a lot in my own journey with depression.
Me as well, and I think that's something that's easy to forget when you're as motivated to give to a cause. Mm-hmm. You can feel our culture teaches us that it's bad to think about ourselves, and that taking time out to take care of ourselves makes us selfish. And I think that's such a toxic idea, because I can't give the best of myself if I don't take care of myself. If I'm in the midst of a deep depression and I'm thinking about other things and I'm really anxious, I'm not going to be the best that I can be to help other people and to advance a cause. So it's almost a requirement. I mean, if you want to be as effective as you can be, even if you're not thinking of your own health, which you should be, but even if you're not, if you want to be the most effective, it's okay to lay that burden down for a second and let other people carry it for a minute while you rest and take care of yourself.
Yes, so well said.
We're going to end the show with a segment we call Be a Better Ally. We know that our audience isn't going to just be LGBT folks. We may have atheist allies who just want to learn more about the LGBT community. We may have Christians and other religious people listening who are curious and just want to know what we're about. So we're going to end this and every show with a segment dedicated to asking the people who support us to learn how to be better allies in everyday life. Since it's the first episode of the show, I'm going to start us off with how to be a better ally for transgender people. And today we're going to talk about pronouns.
Yay! My favorite kind of...
Yay, pronouns! To most people, they don't give pronouns a second thought. You're a dude, it's he, him, his. You're a girl, and it's she, her, hers. Simple, right? I get asked a lot why pronouns are such a big deal for trans people. And the simple answer is that it's important to us for the same reason it's important to everyone else. Even if you're not sexist or a closet misogynist and you're not personally offended by someone suggesting that you're a gender other than the one you identify as, you're still being called something you're not, and it might make you a little uncomfortable. And it's really the same for trans people. My identity as a woman and as a trans woman is partially wrapped up in the name and the pronouns that I use. The quote-unquote he that used to be me was someone who was in hiding, scared, alone, anxious, depressed, and the she that I am now is an outgoing, confident, and just freaking stoked on life human being. Being misgendered is it's being identified with a person that I no longer am, and it's an identity that I desperately am trying to leave behind. So another thing that might come up is the idea of using gender-neutral pronouns. Not every trans person identifies strictly within the gender binary. Some people identify as bigender, third gender, agender, non-gender, And there are many, many other descriptions of experiences that aren't necessarily male or female. Some of these folks prefer the gender-neutral pronoun they. I know this can be awkward for some people, and I'll be the first to admit that it was a little awkward for me at first, too. It's not that I thought there was anything wrong with it, I'm just not used to using language in that way. But what I realized, and what everyone needs to realize, is that it's not about me, it's not about us. It's about us respecting the other person's identity by referring to them in the way in which they prefer. You'll get over the awkwardness quickly, I promise. And with that, that's going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. Before we go, I want you to know, if you're hurting, if you're scared, if you feel alone, like no one cares, like no one understands, I want you to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, and knows that you're capable of amazing things. Please reach out. I'm at Gaytheist Callie on Twitter. That's GaytheistCallie.
This is me, Daniel. I'm at Daniel Wolfsong, DanielWolfsong on Twitter.
And I'm Jonathan, and my Twitter is at NerdCub, NERDKUB.
We are at Facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email The Gaytheist Manifesto at gmail.com. Take care of yourselves, friends. I want to thank Daniel and Jonathan for being part of this.
My pleasure.
You're very welcome.
Until next time, this has been The Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network.